All right, so psychedelics and gender identity. We're very excited about it. Pulling Chris up here on stage too. And we're going live on Facebook in case anyone cares. Yay. And being a webinar, anyone in the audience, if you have questions, just send them to us. We will answer them. We can't see you, so if you have anything you want to share, we can read your question out. I'm very excited today. Hey, Chris. Cool. So this is recorded. Many people have said they will be watching it afterwards. So hopefully it will go down in history as an important source of information for folks. And I think we'll just start with doing some quick intros. And then we have some presentations. Each person here is going to present a short 10 or 20 minute presentation, and then we'll launch into questions. So we may not use up the whole 2 hours, but we have 2 hours in case. And yeah, I'm excited. Everyone's able to share if it lets you share screen. Is that as a co-host? Is that true? Cool. Well, great. So I'll start, and then we'll go around. I'm Dr. Hannah McLane from SoundMind, as many of you know. In the spirit of accessibility, I'm going to pull up a written version of my bio so people don't have to just hear it. They can actually see it too. I have dyslexia and auditory processing disorder. So, it's always helpful when I see things. So today we're going to talk about gender and sexuality and how it has to do with psychedelics. I think, in a lot of ways, it's I think the gender aspect of this is just sort of starting to be talked about. Maya and I wrote a trans-affirming psychedelic care guide. Was it like 6 months ago, something around that? And Chris started doing some research in this population too, and there hasn't been that much about it prior. So we'll talk a little bit about these aspects of our work, and just really wanting to start the conversation. A lot of this is just about starting, what are we talking about? How can we think about it? What are the words we're using? What words are we using with our patients or clients? So my bio is up here. I use she or they pronouns. And, I think, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think it's interesting because I explain in my bio, this is up on my website, SoundMind.center. So I say, my pronouns are she, they. I'm a physician, psychoanalyst, and entrepreneur. I founded the SoundMind Institute. It's a nationwide, we kind of worldwide at this point, psychedelic facilitator training and research initiative aimed at bringing ethics, equity, and innovation to the psychedelic ecosystem. We also develop accessible, peer-supported, group-based psychedelic protocols. And I have a passion for global health, public health, and ethics. And we are currently focusing these peer initiatives on veterans, BIPOC with PTSD. And in my bio, I identified as queer, white, able-bodied, and neurodiverse. And then I grew up in New Hampshire, and I spent several years in South America and East Asia. And I find it really interesting that, there's sometimes people want to make comments on things if you have your bio up on social media or other places. And the fact that my bio says queer, I've gotten more comments about that than anything else in my bio, which is really interesting. One person said, they commented like, why would we care that this person's queer? Why is that in a bio? And it's very interesting because it's like, well, if you were queer, you'd realize it's really amazing to see that in someone else's bio, that someone's out in the open about how they identify. I had, when that appeared in my bio, I had friends and family reach out and get confused. What does that mean? And the fact that no one is commenting on why are you saying able-bodied? How does that relate to anything? And what does neurodiverse mean? Most people don't even know what that means. For me, I have ADHD and dyslexia, and it's been a big part of my life, but no one's asked me to explain what that means. So I think it's really just speaks to the importance of just talking about these things and and making it out in the open. There is Chakruna is doing Queering Psychedelics 2 in the spring that all of us will be at as well. So there's, there has been some conferences about this, but it's still, in its infancy, I think. And a lot of what we're thinking about here is how, as facilitators, because all of us are facilitators, how do we really help foster an environment in which the patients and the clients we're working with are able to explore. So being embodying someone that is able to explore and express can give that permission to your clients. And then I guess just the end of my bio is just that I did a bunch of different degrees. I have a master's in speech pathology, an MD from Brown Medical School. I did a public health master's at Harvard and residencies in neurology and occupational medicine, and then a patient safety fellowship at the VA hospital in Philly, which I loved. And then I also trained to be a psychoanalyst. So that's me. Very excited to talk about gender and psychedelics, and I will pass the mic to Maya. I have lots more to say, but that's where I'm starting.
Cool. Hey, everybody. So glad to be here. I'm Maya. I am a queer, white, trans femme person, and currently residing in Oregon. Currently doing work as the psilocybin program coordinator at SoundMind, as well as a private practice as a clinical hypnotherapist. And as Hannah said, co-author of the Trans-Affirming Care in the Psychedelic Space Guide. Yeah, I guess just a little bit about, I think I'm so passionate about the field of psychedelics because they've been tools that have really helped me to understand my identity at a deeper level. And I think just having experienced such an amazing modality of getting in touch with my inner self and just exploring identity, gender, sexuality through psychedelics. I just feel a strong passion for continuing to work in this space, because I think it's something that's really important to talk about that happens so much and isn't talked about enough, is how psychedelics can really be tools that can just bring up these awarenesses of different aspects of our identities that we otherwise might be kind of pushing back or kind of not ready to address within ourselves. So yeah, I guess that's it for me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Maya. Emma.
All right. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I am Emma Knighton, and my identities: I'm white, queer, polyamorous, able-bodied, native English speaker. Gender-wise, I identify as a non-binary femme, and I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. And my preference for pronouns is that she and they be used interchangeably. I have ancestral roots in Celtic Druidry, and that's a really big part of my life. My connection to, the question of when were my people indigenous before they became white is a really big part of my unlearning of systems of oppression and how I ground myself in the psychedelic space. So important thing to know about me. I live on Duwamish and Coast Salish lands, which are currently known as Seattle, Washington. And professionally, I'm a somatic trauma therapist in my office right now. And I do a lot of work around consent in the psychedelic space. So I'm going to be talking today about consent practices and how that's intersected with psychedelics and queer populations. I'm also a psychedelic organizer and do all sorts of work all over the field. And in my private practice as a trauma therapist, my niche is this really cool intersection of complex PTSD, queer identity development, and psychedelics. And so it's just kind of become this work that I do with folks who are, realizing, oh, I have this trauma mostly from childhood, as the populations I work with. And through that process of really realizing oh, these systems that have been built up inside me in terms of how we deal with trauma don't work for me anymore, and how that's really interconnected with looking at the systems in our society and our cultures that don't work for me either, and this queer identity that so often emerges out of that process, and psychedelics being a really wonderful agent and friend in that emergent beautiful healing journey for people. And I've just kind of found myself situated in the middle of that for all of my clients, which I really love, and is a big representation of my own process with my queer identity, and something I'll talk about during my piece as well. So nice to be here. Chris, over to you.
Hi, I'm Chris Stauffer, and I use he and they pronouns interchangeably. I am also white. I come from Swiss, Irish, Scottish, British, and German ancestry. And I found out recently through ancestry.com that all of 4 of my grandparents' lineages come from Mormon ancestry. I did not know that before, but I grew up in Utah. I came out as queer in high school. And then more recently, genderqueer, which was a lot of terminology that we didn't have back then, but thinking back, it describes me my entire life. And I'm a psychiatrist and a researcher. Right now I'm in Portland, Oregon, and we're about to start a study of MDMA-assisted group therapy for veterans with PTSD. And then I'll tell you a little bit about another study we have coming up, MDMA-assisted group therapy with transgender and gender diverse individuals. And let's see, so I've been working in psychedelic therapy research since 2016. And I was lucky enough to help co-design and co-facilitate a study of psilocybin-assisted group psychotherapy with gay men who are long-term AIDS survivors in San Francisco, and that was really enriching. I think one of the things that inspired me to do this work is because we were in San Francisco doing MDMA-assisted therapy, the phase 3 trials, we were getting a diverse group of people applying to be in the study. But as they went through this long screening process, a lot of people were getting screened out. And I actually crunched the numbers and found that the more marginalized identities someone had, the more likely they were to be screened out of the study and not even get to the enrollment phase. And so that's something that is leading the work. And I'll talk more about this kind of during my presentation, but just to kind of put that out there as well. And very excited to be here. And I'm so always inspired by what Hannah's doing. And we always laugh at how we kind of get inspired to do similar work at like similar times. So I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, totally. It's like you're working peer support veterans. We're doing that too. Wait, you're published a trans thing. We're doing things too. It's like, this is awesome. Yeah, and I think, I think the work that you're doing is really helping inform the field with the academic work and really keeping it relevant in many different ways for people like in the institutions and outside. So thank you for that work. Also, Emma, I just wanted to mention Emma teaches the aspect of our training program. Right now we have 85 students in our class, and we're one of the, I think, 6 organizations training for Oregon psilocybin program right now in the country. And Emma teaches about many different things, informed consent and identities, but one exercise we do is work through writing out your complete bio. So there's the way Emma presents it, there's lots more information than most people usually include. So it's like, what does it feel like to include all that stuff? Even if you don't want to say it publicly, you could try saying it to yourself. Like, what does that feel like? If you write your gender, sexuality, the, occupied land that you're on, the, whether you're neurodiverse or not, whether you're able-bodied or not, whether you're white, whether you're English speaking, whether you've been incarcerated. There's so many things that put us on the spectrum of privilege or marginalized status, and just kind of acknowledging, I think even just writing it down, and even if you don't share it, it helps you acknowledge like the privilege you do have, and the aspects of your identity that might be harder to function with. So or that puts you in a minority to other people in the population. So I think it's just really important to have that, to sort of think about it. And then, sometimes we also let it drop away and not fixate too much on any one thing. But I think it's just so interesting to see people do that. And then they practice reading it if they feel comfortable, and just seeing people go through that process, I think is so cool. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the material that Maya is going to talk about, I think, is really relevant before or after. So I think this will be okay. So I guess just to put forth a couple of definitions. So cisgender is people who have gender identities that correspond with the sex they were assigned at birth. And then gender diversity is a term that I like. I know people talk about gender expansiveness. There's all sorts of terms, but I like this as kind of an umbrella term. So gender diversity includes individuals who identify as neither cisgender man nor cisgender woman. And so that would include potentially people who are transgender, whose identities, gender identities are different from their sex assigned at birth. But also includes two-spirit, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, agender, and those who are fluid in their gender identities. Researchers estimate, so I guess one thing to mention is because gender is defined federally as male or female, government surveys like the US Census don't ask about transgender or gender diverse identities. So we don't actually have numbers like we have for a lot of other demographic factors, but researchers estimate that about 0.5 to 3% of the US population identify as transgender or gender diverse. And something that I find really interesting is throughout recorded history, there have been hundreds of cultures who have recognized third, fourth, fifth, or more genders. While the gender binary that exists today that most of us are familiar with is actually a relatively new construct. And so PBS has this really great map online. It's just a map of gender diverse cultures throughout time. And so you can click on all these little locations, and here you can see Myanmar. There's a third gender consisting of males assuming the dress and social role of women, known in Burmese slang as a cult. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but they serve often as spirit mediums in the indigenous animistic belief system. And then also just distinguishing between sexual orientation and gender identity. While some of them are gay, not all of them are. And so this is a fun tool to kind of go and explore if you get a chance. And then this is a study. This is a study with the veterans. So it's 5,135 transgender veterans and about 3 times as many non-transgender veterans. It's a case control study, but it shows some things that are not great. So looking at adjusted odds ratios, the odds of depression among transgender veterans is 4.5 times more than for non-transgender veterans. And then PTSD, 2.82 times the rate, serious mental illness, 3.3 times, and suicidality over 4 times the rate of non-transgender veterans. And another thing to acknowledge here is that transgender, gender diverse people are more than twice as likely to receive threats of violence relative to cisgender sexual minorities. And so this is other people in the LGBTQ umbrella who are already at an elevated risk relative to heterosexual counterparts. Violence against transgender, gender diverse people has been classified as a national epidemic by the Human Rights Campaign. And that numbers for all of these things are even higher for transgender, gender diverse people of color. So even though we have all of this epidemiologic data showing these higher rates of mental illness, I wanted to point out that we don't really have the research that's targeted at intervening. So this is something that the National Center for PTSD has hosts online. It's called the PTSD repository. I think right now it includes almost 400 randomized controlled trials. It's like all of the high quality randomized controlled trials looking at PTSD treatments to date. And as of now, not a single one included explicitly transgender or gender diverse participants. You can see 69% reported both men and women, 13% men only, 12% women only, and then 6% didn't mention gender information. So it's possible that transgender, gender diverse people participated in these studies at some point, but it wasn't explicitly reported. And there are no studies up to this point that look at PTSD interventions specifically in transgender, gender diverse populations. And this may partially be due to the historical medical pathologization of gender. Transgender, gender diverse people, there's a lot of research actually that shows they experience significant experiences of discrimination in healthcare settings by healthcare professionals. And so looking at through the DSM, earlier DSM in the 1960s started adding transvesticism as a mental disorder, became transsexualism in 1980. And then gender identity disorder was a DSM diagnosis for a long time. And that was just changed in the last DSM, the DSM-5. And the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is kind of what what mental health practitioners and also the insurance system looks at in order to pay for services. And so gender identity disorder in 2013 became gender dysphoria. And so it's a positive shift in terminology, and it also remains in the DSM and to help maintain healthcare access for those who are wanting to access it. But this just shows how recently sort of just the idea of a gender identity that's non-conforming to the general kind of norms of society has been pathologized. And then this is another website, maybe not as fun to look at, but I think is important. This is an anti-trans bill tracker website. Right now, or last time I looked, there were 140 anti-trans bills across the country. And so this is something that's active. This is legislation that's explicitly anti-transgender. And why does this matter? I think this is a helpful figure. This is the pyramid of hate. And so when you look at the bottom, sort of acts of bias, this is kind of the foundation. A lot of this is unconscious, remains implicit, things like microaggression, stereotyping, erasure, not often or not always intentional malintent. But if that goes unchecked, the next layer of the pyramid is acts of prejudice. So bullying, scapegoating, avoiding groups of people. And I think if we other enough and kind of don't understand each other enough, that can move into acts of discrimination. And that can include things like discriminatory legislation. And then that can turn into bias motivated violence. So things like mass shootings, targeted hate crime. And I mentioned that violence toward transgender people is considered a national epidemic. And then throughout history, this sort of pyramid has led explicitly to genocide. So this is just, I think, a helpful framework. I guess going back to the research, so I wanted to specifically start looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, which is promising treatment for PTSD. We know there are higher rates of PTSD among transgender, gender diverse people. The National Bioethics Advisory Commission recommends that when working with vulnerable populations or populations experiencing structural vulnerability, that they should be included in the planning phases of studies and included throughout the study. So we started with putting together focus groups, and this was Oregon Health and Science University funded this, and we put together 3 focus groups, essentially gathered people let me tell you the study criteria were people who had mental health treatment for a trauma-related disorder, or it didn't even have to be a disorder, it was just trauma-related mental health care. And then we kind of got their experiences with that. There hasn't been a lot of research just looking at trauma-related mental health care. There's been a lot of research looking at transgender, gender diverse people's experiences in healthcare in general, and also mental health care, but this is specifically trauma-related mental health care. Then we assess their openness to participate in experimental trauma-related mental health intervention research, and then specifically MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And we did a little bit of psychoeducation around what the current protocol looks like. And then we gathered specific feedback on protocol design and moving into clinical practice of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy specifically for this population. and you can read our outcomes in Frontiers in Psychiatry. And maybe at this point I'll hand it back over to Maya, because I think this starts to get into your work. One thing I did want to mention, though, is we have been working with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, to do an investigator-initiated trial of MDMA-assisted group therapy for transgender, gender-diverse people. And part of that is diversifying co-therapy teams. So historically, throughout psychedelic psychotherapy, when working with co-therapy teams, which is very common, it used to be standard for it to be a male and female co-therapy dyad. But that's changed. MAPS no longer requires that. I was part of a genderqueer co-therapy dyad, which was really cool. MAPS has given over 125 or more scholarships to LGBTQIA plus practitioners to do the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy training. About 40 of those have been transgender, gender-diverse practitioners. And in preparation for our clinical trial, we are working with a whole range of transgender and gender-diverse practitioners. And so these are some of the therapists that will be working on this study of MDMA-assisted group therapy for transgender, gender-diverse participants.
Thanks, Chris. Amazing. Yeah, I think there might be questions about your work after. Does Emma or Maya, do you have any questions for Chris about that right now? No. Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I can't wait for those studies. I love your genderqueer dyad. Sweet. Maya, take it away.
Cool. All right. Second time's the charm, right?
Exactly.
Perfect. Can you all see this?
Yep.
Awesome. Perfect. So I'm just going to present a little bit about some excerpts of the guide that Hannah and I co-authored. So the guide is entitled Trans-affirming Care in the Psychedelic Space, or the Psychedelic Ecosystem, interchangeable. Let me move these around quick. Oops. Is there any way I can minimize faces? Oh, wait. Perfect. There we go. Technology, right? So I guess I'll start off talking a little bit about why gender-affirming care is needed in the psychedelic ecosystem. So psychedelics have the potential to be powerful tools for personal growth and healing, but only if the individual feels comfortable and safe in the environment. So when we talk about gender-affirming care, that means that the individual's identity is respected and affirmed. So this can include using correct pronouns, chosen name, providing a safe space to explore identity, and essentially just creating an environment where people can feel like they can be themselves without discrimination and judgment. I think it's incredibly important, especially in the psychedelic ecosystem. I think like Chris was saying, historically spaces have tended to be kind of separated into male-female spaces, or therapists have been like male-female, and oftentimes there's a lack of representation on gender diversity and transgender visibility. And I think even explicitly like being in a space where I think there's this idea of like seeing people that are like you, and I think as we enter a space where like I've been in many spaces where like I'm the trans person or the queer person, and even if nothing is inherently said about the identities that show up in the space, as a person who holds that identity, it can feel really isolating. So I think that's why it's really important in the psychedelic ecosystem to recognize that these are topics and issues that really show up in sessions, even with clients that we might not be explicitly aware, like, oh, this person is definitively working through gender dysphoria, or things that they're not vocalizing, but it can be a very internal experience. So one of the most important things that we can do as practitioners is to provide a safe and supportive space for any trans clients and any clients with diverse identities. And like I said before, just creating an environment where the client feels respected and values essentially a safe space to kind of open up and talk about what it means to hold their specific identities, or to even explore identities that might not be kind of like definitive or recognized. And I think that's why as practitioners, it's important for us to think about how nuanced the trans experience can be, and what trans people might face. I think there can be like this blanket understanding of this blanket, like, oh yeah, trans people are fine, like I'll work with trans people, but it goes so much deeper than that, and into this societal discrimination, violence, rejection from people around them. Just so many details that without educating ourselves explicitly, we might not be aware of at all. So that's why it's important for us to learn about like the specific types of trauma that show up in trans populations, different forms of PTSD that show up in trans populations, and just kind of like creating a sense of self-compassion and kind of self-exploration on that. And many trans people have a lifetime of experience with self-criticism and shame, and it can often be magnified by experiences of trauma. So hopefully as practitioners, we can help clients start to view themselves in a more positive light, and to develop more compassion and understanding for themselves, and also understand just kind of like what it's like to show up in a society as a trans person, or as a gender diverse or queer person. So I kind of want to go through a couple of tips to hold a safe space. I think these are just like very foundational concepts, and I think it's easy to kind of like say a blanket term like acknowledge your privilege, but it goes so much deeper. So I just want to kind of say that this is a lifelong journey of recognizing that we can talk about these concepts, we can kind of have a good idea about these concepts, but until we actually like put that into practice, I think I wish we could just talk for hours and hours on what it is to acknowledge your privilege, and so on and so forth. So privilege is discussed as something referring to an individual's wealth or racial identity, but can also refer to people's everyday advantages based on gender identity and a plethora of other identities. For example, most cisgender people will never have to think about which public restroom to use. And in contrast, trans and gender non-conforming community members must consider this every single time they leave the house. So another example is healthcare access. For many trans and gender non-conforming individuals, finding a healthcare provider that's an ally and knowledgeable about trans-specific health issues can be such a significant challenge. So if you want to be an excellent ally, it's vital to consider how your privilege affects your life and those around you. Another good tidbit is to just listen and affirm. Just listen to what your trans clients say and show them that you understand and support them. When they share instances of discrimination and difficulty in their lives, don't question their interpretation of a situation or comment. Don't downplay any experiences, but just affirm their experiences and recognize the effects of oppression in the trans community. And this can include transphobia, discrimination, rejection, microaggressions. And yeah, just a great way to navigate these topics is to invite clients to share regarding these issues. Providing support in addressing trauma reactions, establishing healthy coping mechanisms and actions. A huge one is using inclusive language. So when you hear someone using oppressive language, it's important to explain why it's hurtful, offensive, and contributes to oppression. I think this is something that sometimes it's so unconscious. People, of course, like might say, oh, I don't intend to use that language in an oppressive way. But the matter of fact is it's not about the intention, it's about the result and the effect it has on individuals who are hearing that language. And this is often seen in like media and TV that, you know, when people joke about queer people or trans people, people are like, oh, it's just funny to laugh about these things, but inherently a queer trans person sees that or hears that and can be really easy to internalize that as oppressive language. So just recognize that every struggle of a marginalized group has a history, a background of accepted and overt discrimination and violence, and by using oppressive language, you add to that experience. And do your own research. This is another really big one. I can't tell you how many times people come to me and they're like, you're trans, and we need to understand this a little bit more, and you're the expert, so like, please educate me. And I tend to be happy educating. A lot of trans peers and a lot of trans people don't like to spend so much energy educating people all the time. So it's incredibly important to, like, as an ally, to do your own research. because it can be extremely tiring to keep answering questions. There's so many resources out there. There's the trans-affirming guide. There's so many guides and websites and resources that can help just educate and provide a very basic understanding of what is it like to be an ally. And then afterwards comes the educating component. As an ally, it's incredibly important to educate other allies. And I think this kind of goes hand in hand with that, with the last slide, because it's like the more we educate, the more we grow awareness and grow acceptance of marginalized identities. So just offering explanations, resources, when someone seems to have misunderstood something or unintentionally acting disrespectfully. So if you hear someone say something oppressive, correct them. Each time you educate someone, it's one less time that a marginalized person has to do it themselves. So yeah, you can correct their speech, such as correcting pronouns or correcting somebody's name, referring to a trans person as with their birth name, or saying harmful things or making jokes that are inappropriate and oppressive. And that just helps to create a safer and more inclusive environment for everybody. So I think it comes down to having accountability for the words we say and the actions we take, and then also holding other allies accountable. So, and with that is also reflecting on your biases. I think just like as humans, we hold on to so many inherent biases based off of the society we live in, how we grew up, the people that we're surrounded with. So it's so important we kind of reflect on that and understand like why we believe the things we believe. So you might even say or do things that make a person feel excluded or invisible without noticing it. So some questions I always like to throw out there that I think are just really good reflection questions. How have I benefited from sticking to specific gender roles? How have I contributed to reinforcing binary gender expectations? Were there any times in my life I've wandered from society's gender expectations, and were there any negative impacts? Do I treat transgender individuals the same way I treat cisgender individuals? If not, what's different? But I think it's just important. I think just as we go through life, we grow by questioning ourselves and the beliefs that we're kind of showing up in the world with. And it's so healthy to question that and to kind of use that as a tool for our own self-growth. So yeah, and there's hundreds of other questions that I always recommend asking. So yeah, as like a summary, the tools and guidance in this presentation are all necessary to be a good ally. By using correct language, being sensitive, aware, calling out others when necessary, doing the work of self-reflection. You might get appreciation from others, but don't expect it. I think oftentimes people get this like really good feeling of like, oh yeah, I just like affirm some of these pronouns. But that's like very basic, you know, it's something that should be just foundational and doesn't always need this like gold star of approval. You're not owed anything just for treating people with respect, even though the rest of the world doesn't always do that. And if you're having a hard time understanding or processing or coming to terms with something relating to a person in your life, try to get support from other allies rather than the person in question. And they're likely going through something even more complex, and you need to support them. So reach out to family members, friends, colleagues, or community support groups, and try to build a network of other allies you can lean on. Thank you. I have my email listed here if anyone is just curious to get in touch. And I think Hannah posted in the chat the link to the trans guide. So if anyone's just like interested in checking out more of the trans guide, highly recommend. It's a really great resource. It's really fun to make. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, and the trans guide is free. And you can print it out. It's a PDF, so you can send it to your friends. You can keep it for yourself. We do not charge. If you get really pumped about the information being free, you can donate to the nonprofit. But we feel very strongly about providing free resources, even like this panel today. You know, there's certain topics that I think I learned this from Emma, because I was like, you know, I think there's this push within the psychedelic ecosystem to start asking people to be exclusive to different programs. And there's just certain, or even topics or slideshows, but there's certain topics that just should be blasted and get them out as much as you can to as many places. So you can also feel free to share the link to this webinar with any friends. I think a few things came up for me as you were talking, just to remind people. that like make sure that your educational material is ethically sourced, meaning like that the person, that the people on panels like this are being paid. You know, even we pay everyone educating, even if the attendance is not, even if the attendees aren't paying, because it ultimately, you know, benefits our organization to have really good material out there. So ask if the material that you're watching is that the educators are being paid. There's a lot of really big psychedelic summits and things that the speakers don't get anything. And just remember that if your friend is educating you, that you kind of owe them. You know, it's like, it's time that, you know, maybe you can educate them about something that they want to know, or maybe you can, you know, use that and to educate others for them, so they don't have to be taking all their time. I think it's really important to note that. And I think sometimes it comes as like a, oh, educate me is like it's almost like a nervous thing that people are like, oh, I'm woke, like tell me more about it, I can have this conversation. So it's sometimes it's not even, I've just seen this happen, that it doesn't even seem like the person's that curious, but they just want to have something to prove that they're, you know, willing to have the conversation. So note when you're asking questions, are they real questions? I think it's also really important to notice when there are things that come out around language that like you can educate on, even though people aren't asking you. So if you're an ally, I'll give an example of when I was in residency, some of my co-residents in my like co-residents, meaning other doctors, were like commenting on like how confusing they is as a pronoun. It's so confusing. How do you even know how to conjugate? And it was like everyone was joking about how it's like so hilariously confusing. And I was like, you know, I don't think, like, if you're getting it wrong and you're confused, just say you're confused and ask someone, like, how do I conjugate the verb? Because is like they are. You can ask. No, just conjugate it as if it was they plural. You know, they are. Because it's really hard to not do that. I've just noticed in the last like 5-10 years that there are people that that will end up like making fun of a thing because they just don't understand how to work with it. And you can say like, yeah, you can, don't, if you're embarrassed, just ask, like, I'm here, like, you know. And there's other things that you might be confused about, like a lot of people are confused about the term gender assigned at birth, and they go, oh, biological sex. And you say like, yeah, but the reason we don't do that is because it was the wrong one. Like when you say biological sex, that's kind of implying that should have been the correct one. So if you don't understand a term, you can Google it and it will explain, like, why is gender assigned at birth? Why is that term used? You could easily find it. So anything that feels confusing, just Google it and figure out like why that is being used and not the thing that you think might be more obvious, or the words that might come out of your mouth. If it's something else, there's probably a reason it's being used. I also think I'm just like naming all the microaggressions I see, but if you use a wrong pronoun, you don't have to explain why you use the wrong pronoun. I've seen that a lot, that people go like she, I'm sorry, like my mind is reading you as she, you know, it's like that. You don't have to explain that. They know why you use the wrong pronoun. And I think you just say sorry and you correct it rather than making a big scene because you feel embarrassed. So I think just these kinds of things and modeling that, if you're able to model, you know, if someone changes their pronoun to they and you keep using the he or she, you can model, you know, you can keep correcting yourself. Oh, sorry, I meant they. You don't have to like walk away feeling embarrassed and then think about it for the rest of the day. You know, you just say like, sorry, oops. And then other people learn from you, like, oh, this person's changing their pronoun. Oh, that person's getting the correct pronoun. That's so cool. So I think just keeping each other accountable and just being there for education. So if you've watched this webinar, you probably know a lot more than many of your friends and how to talk about it. You have resources, just spreading that. Is there anything else? I think that's what I have. Emma, I know that, and thank you, Maya, that's great. It's a wonderful resource and I'm so excited. And it really, so many people have just said that it's, they're so excited because it's, even as facilitators, it's like, how do we create these spaces? And as you said, you don't necessarily even know what your patients or clients are going through. So it's interesting when we're doing this peer training and we're figuring out the guidelines around being a peer, and we have these two Marines that are both religious and talk about God. And I was just very clear with the peer person sitting with the other person, like, just make sure you don't interpret any of the journey as like Christian God, because you don't necessarily know that that's the God that they're seeing. So you really just have to be, even if you talk about that aside and you both know each other's belief systems, things can change in psychedelic spaces, and just leaving that open to the journey, or to really explore. And that these things might come up like really late in life. They might come up in different ways. They might come up as contents of a journey that you can help someone unpack. So yeah, I think Emma, maybe you and Maya can share a little bit. I know you're talking about maybe sharing a little bit about your own story, or a little bit more about your own story. So maybe this would be a good time to do that.
Yeah, do you want to do that first? Or do you want me to talk about consent stuff first? What makes sense for y'all?
I don't know, either one. Do you want to, I guess maybe how about do your consent stuff, so then we'll have all the presentations out. Yeah. And then we'll go and tell some personal stories. So don't go anywhere. It gets really juicy.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, Hannah. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Maya. Everyone, you all are brilliant. Just sitting here soaking it all up. And yeah, so just to remind everyone, I'm Emma Knighton, she, they pronouns. And I'm going to use the word queer to represent the LGBTQIA2S+ umbrella. So just a kind of, vocabulary note for the way that I'm talking. And then I also just want to acknowledge that, so I'm going to be talking a lot about consent, and I do a lot of work about consent in the psychedelic space. And most of the work that I do and most of my training comes from the kink world and from sex work communities. And so wanting to just acknowledge both of those communities and acknowledge that those are communities that experience active oppression and violence and criminalization. And so there's a living fight for liberation among those communities. And so I just really want to honor and lift up them as brilliant resources, and really like the gold standard for consent in communities that I am a part of and also not a part of. So just wanting to honor their presence and those lineages in the room with me as I'm talking. And so we're going to be talking about kind of like taking what Maya said and looking at like, okay, what does it look like to be a safe enough practitioner? And so for folks who are listening, who are practitioners, you can take these things and kind of reflect on how do these intersect with how I am as a practitioner in the room, and people who are not practitioners, but access psychedelic services, and people who are both of those things. Just encouraging you to reflect on, like, is this what I've talked about, what Hannah and Chris and Maya have talked about, thinking about, is this the standard that you've received from your practitioners? Are there things that, you haven't received that you feel like you have realized during these presentations, oh, like that would actually feel much better, feel much safer for me, and want to just really empower people to advocate for themselves and their communities and talk about and express what you need to be able to access psychedelics in a way that feels safe enough for you. And I just want to talk for a minute about that, like, safe enough term. Personally, I don't believe that safe period exists for anyone, and particularly for people who experience structural oppression and trauma, which is most of us. And so if we think about what does it look like to be a safe enough practitioner, what does it look like to have a safe enough space? And so safe enough for what? I think about it as safe enough to take on the risk that is present in any situation. So there's an inherent risk in engaging with psychedelics. There's an inherent risk in just like having relationships, right? Or being a person in the world. And so this question of how do we consent to the risk that is present in these psychedelic spaces, there's, as most of us know, there's an increased vulnerability that comes along with engaging with psychedelics. There's an increased vulnerability with just like therapy services in general, and adding these molecules on board open us up in pretty intense ways and expanded ways, and can really shift the way that our consciousness intersects with ourselves, with our bodies, and the people and the world around us. And so this means that the risk is higher, we're more open, we're more vulnerable to harm in those spaces. And that's just like baseline for everybody, right? And then we add on experiences of structural oppression, like people who have queer bodies and queer identities experience in the world, and there's even more risk added into that space. So we need to think about, like, how do we consent to this risk, and what is the process of consenting to that risk look like in the relationship between practitioner and client. A lot of the work that I do is around training people, like how to have consent practices that are mostly in preparation sessions to then apply them in dosing sessions and then continue to work on them in integration sessions and come back to them. Consent is something that is alive at all times, can be revoked at any time, and is a constant negotiation. Consent is not something where we just say yes or no once and then that's it. Unfortunately, that's much of how our society teaches us how to do consent, and that's just not true, and not an actual representation of what consent looks like as a fluid thing that is moving and kind of dancing with our relationship in whatever container we're in. So just kind of going back to something that Chris talked about, so the pyramid of hate that Chris showed, and kind of that like spectrum of how violence and hate gets perpetuated among communities who've experienced oppression. And just thinking about like having a queer body in society means that you have probably experienced some kind of trauma on a societal level. You've probably experienced some kind of oppression. And there's a big spectrum, right? And so what we need to expect is when we're working with people with queer identities is that they are coming in with that in their bodies, right? I am coming into a room with that in my body around, microaggressions and violence that I've experienced because of my sexuality, gender, and polyamorous status in my identities in the world. And so even if I'm not coming into maybe an MDMA session or whatever you're using, as like saying, I want to work on the trauma around my queer identity, it's in the room with me anyways. And so we need to be aware of these things and be able to hold that as like a part of the person without hyper focusing on this is the only thing we're working on, but being able to create space for the multiplicity of the human being that's in front of you and acknowledging these trauma histories because of the existence of the oppression in society. So the way that I talk about this from practitioner lenses, I use the words trauma-attuned consent. We hear a lot about trauma-informed care. And so just to take a second to define the differences there, trauma-informed care to me is very cognitive. It's the sense of I know I have a sense of like what is going on for you. I have a kind of intellectual understanding of what it means for your trauma to be in the room with us and how to be a practitioner in relationship with that trauma and with you as a person. Trauma-attuned consent takes it a little bit further and kind of brings in the body and the nervous system and just like kind of energetics of the relational space, and saying that practitioners can be attuned to the trauma that is happening with my body, with your body, and that we can have consent that is, again, that kind of active, fluid dynamic that changes and morphs over time in this negotiation between our bodies as we're, moving through this space together in the container of psychedelic sessions. So just explaining that we need to be attuning constantly to the consent that is existing between each other. And so I'm going to go over just a few kind of like how-to ways to do that. The biggest piece is like self-work of the practitioner, of the facilitator. Every single one of us lives in a society that is transphobic and homophobic, which means that we have all internalized this in some way. And whether you identify under the queer umbrella or not, like these are things that are living in your body and in your nervous system and the way that you engage with the world. And so being aware of that and doing work to unlearn the internalized homophobia and transphobia is absolutely a like baseline foundational requirement if you want to be a safe enough practitioner to be working with folks in this community. And that's whether you identify as queer or not, because there are many different ways to be queer. And just because you have one identity does not mean that you are immediately safe enough for anybody else who exists under that queer umbrella. There's a lot of within group violence that occurs as well. And so just that being a consistent place of work that we all need to hold in the same way as, unlearning white supremacy, ableism, all the different ways that oppression exists within our society and gets internalized in our bodies. And then specifically something to think about when we're practicing with psychedelics is that, it's a big population within the queer community of people who have religious and spiritual trauma. Conversion therapy is a very real thing that has happened, and many people have experienced this. And there is a big overlap in the way that a lot of conversion therapy looks and what psychedelic therapy looks like, right? There's this kind of theoretical understanding that we're going to use some form of spirituality to help look at what's going on inside of you, and then use your own inner directed wisdom in connection with these spiritual forces to help you shift your psychology in a way that, you know, is going to be better you in the world. And a lot of conversion therapy has those exact same markers. There's a lot of kind of putting on a theoretical understanding of spirituality, assessing someone's relationship patterns, attachment patterns, psychology through a spiritual lens in many conversion therapy settings. And that happens in psychedelic spaces almost like exhaustively, like it's very present here as well. And so being aware that for people who have spiritual and religious trauma, there's a need to have an even higher attunement to that trauma and how it intersects with you as a psychedelic practitioner. And the risk of re-traumatization is higher with these populations. And so things you can do, so thinking about like, what are the objects that are present in your room, right? If I have a practice space where people come to do psychedelic sessions and I need to have my Buddha statue in the room, right? The question is, who's that for? That's for me as the practitioner. That is not for my client. And if I have, you know, different deities, statues, or if I have different kind of spiritual iconography around my room, that's sending a message to my clients that I am beholden to a specific tradition, and I could potentially be projecting that onto them, which might be very similar and a potential for re-traumatization from someone who's been through religious or spiritual trauma and conversion therapy. And so being really aware of that and doing a lot of space and around this consensual practice of letting a client like walk around the room, look at things, ask like, how does it feel in here? Are there any things you want to remove? Any of your own things you want to bring in here? What does the setup look like? Right? Giving them the chance to really consent to the physical space that they're going to be going into this expanded state of consciousness in, that again has that inherent increased risk. And then just kind of working off of that. So from the physical space into the more like psycho-spiritual space, having a really clear conversation around boundaries, around rituals that practitioners might want to bring in, around frameworks of analysis that might come from a practitioner's own spiritual background. And just being really clear that those are things that can be offered. Those can be really beautiful things that are offered in psychedelic sessions, but that's something that the client needs to consent to. They need to have a very clear awareness of, okay, what does this ritual mean? What does this like perspective of analysis mean? Is this something that I'm okay having in my journey? Or is this something that doesn't feel comfortable to me? And if a client is giving you a no, which is a gift that someone says no to you and sets a clear boundary with you as a practitioner, if that makes you uncomfortable and puts you in a space of not being able to hold space, then you're not the correct practitioner for that person, because doing those rituals and having that framework of analysis is for you, and you are there for the client. And you might kind of hear this question of who is this for is a really helpful and like just kind of foundational level question within consent practices. So you can kind of take this of whenever you're doing anything, who is this for? Who is this for? And what are the layers that show up around who something is for in any kind of interaction? The last piece that I'll mention, Hannah talked about this a little bit earlier, is something that's called your social location disclosure. So being aware of where your identities are, and along lines of privileged or marginalized perspectives in society, right? We are split up in society based off of privileged or subjugated identities, and having a conversation with clients about that. Not all identities are visible. I know for me, I pass as cisgender and straight and monogamous very well. Most people look at me and they see those things. None of those identities are actually who I am in the world. And so there's a conversation there with all of my clients. I'm clearly white, and some people who look white are not actually white, right? And so we need to be having these conversations of what identities are in the room, how do these move between us? And when we have different identities than clients, being able to tell people, yeah, there is a risk of myself as a white person. I have my internalized white supremacy. It's something I'm working on consistently, and it's something I'll never finish in my life. I'm never going to be rid of my internalized white supremacy. So there is an inherent risk for clients of color that are working with me. And that doesn't mean might not be a safe enough person for them to work with, but it needs to be a conversation, and them having an awareness and ability to consent to that risk that's present when working with me because of the structural system that we live in and what we've all internalized.
Can I also add just to that it can be useful to also talk about how in trauma therapy sometimes, or in psychotherapy and psychedelic therapy, often trauma comes out, and it might come out as projecting onto the person based on their identities, and that can actually be really useful, and to let people know that that's like, if that comes up, to talk about it, like, as much as they're comfortable. So if someone is like, whoa, I had this, sudden fear of you because you're white in the session, that can be really important for like to have that conversation and to go into that material for them to help find like where in their body is the internalized or where is the trauma of racism or other identities that they hold.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in, Hannah. And to say that, like, if that kind of experience happening can be a really corrective experience if the practitioner responds well. If the practitioner doesn't respond well, if you get really defensive, if like all of your own shit comes up, that can actually be more re-traumatizing and validating of that fear that that person was having in a maybe more like expanded way than it could have happened if someone is able to receive that and process and stay in it with your client. The last thing I'll say just before we kind of talk about our own experiences, which I'm really excited to do, is just that part of being a safe enough practitioner for queer communities is being able to have room for fluidity, right? If somebody comes in and says, this is where I think my identity's at, and then has a very like expanded or different or whatever experience in your session, like just letting that be okay and affirming, and not needing people to adhere to the specific binary or specific word that they've used. Psychedelics from my perspective are inherently queer, and that there is, that they exist beyond the binaries that are currently prevalent in our dominant systems, which means that like we get to explore things outside of these boxes that we exist in ordinary states of consciousness and in culture. And so, being a safe enough practitioner means being able to like go with the fluidity and just like be with clients in whatever state they're in. And that part of like us consenting to being in that state with clients is being able to be in that state with ourselves as well, because the constriction in our bodies as practitioners that comes up when a client is going through something is often reflective of the constriction that happens in our bodies when we're experiencing a similar thing. So just to kind of wrap up the, heady part of my presentation is just being really clear around like what's happening in your body, attuning to your own trauma, your own identities in the room as a practitioner, and allowing that to be a foundation with which you then attune to your clients and make room for their authentic experience, and letting, that the trauma and the really important piece of consent around that and this question of who is it for to be really structures in how you relate to people in psychedelic spaces. And do you want me to go into my personal story, or do we want
Yeah, totally. I think it's great time to do that. Yeah.
So I just take my notes away so I can just talk from the heart. So for me, the psychedelics are like completely pivotal in my own queer identity journey. A lot of my relationship with psychedelics and spirituality feel like kind of this relearning what I knew as a kid. That's how I often talk about it. If I was this like little, very non-binary child, just like run around in the woods talking to trees all day long, like very druid, very queer. And as I grew up and became an adult and was socialized, the structures, the binaries started coming in and really influencing me. And so, especially in my early 20s, and I'm now in my 30s, but just this process of like having more expanded states, which, sometimes involve psychedelics, sometimes don't, reminded me of what my actual truth was of psychedelics being this open space of like, hey, let's break down, these binaries don't actually exist. And these medicines showing me how nature functions. Like, this is a big thing for me with my queerness, is I just want to like be a tree, really. And that there is this beautiful fluidity within nature, and psychedelics connecting me to that and seeing how, structures that we live in now don't really make any fucking sense. And really having the room to say, okay, let's break those down, and who am I inside, and what does it actually mean to have a balance of form and flow, which is how I talk about like divine masculine, divine feminine, to take the binary words out of it. And like the structure and the creativity and creation and, what supports us, and just being able to really like dance in how those feel in my body and how those move through my spirit is something that I didn't really have access to until I started playing with expanded states. And then the integration of that, I mean, has totally changed my life and really shown me different ways to exist in relationship to myself, in relationship to my body, was massively healing. I have a history of an eating disorder about 10 years ago, and changing my relationship with my body and understanding my queerness was an absolutely integral part of healing from an eating disorder and being somebody who can now like celebrate and honor my body in the world. And, you know, down to like my polyamorous life as well, of learning how to honor and really like be in multiple relationships and see how this like love is this abundant thing, feels like a very queer practice to me and very in line with nature practices and psychedelics, and it all just being this like big soup of moving out of a scarcity mindset that I think is very integrated in the binary that society tells us we need to exist in, that is much more fun to exist outside of. So I keep talking, but I'll stop there. Who else wants to go?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I just also wanted to comment. I think it's really cool how you embody like demonstrating to people how you can like continue to have your identities as a professional, as a mental health care professional. And I think a lot of people don't know how to do that because there's this old way of just your therapist shouldn't know your patient shouldn't know anything about you so that they can map on transference onto you. But then you start thinking about, well, sometimes you want to actually pick a person that shares your identity. Like for me as a dyslexic person, it's not something I can see. So I can't even make that choice. And so it's like, you want to give your patients enough room to, they don't have to know every detail about your life. And you can tell when it becomes about you, like if you're telling the story because you need to tell a story and suddenly the therapy table has shifted, that's usually pretty obvious. But I think, plan disclosures and disclosures that help people understand, like, where you sit in relationship to where they sit in terms of identities can be really helpful. And I think more of us should do more of it. I think as a psychoanalyst, I've been trained in like the old model that people should know nothing about you. And it's really interesting that I had been seeing a patient for about 2 years, once a week for psychotherapy. And then she came into ketamine therapy at SoundMind, and just the nature of the psychedelic therapy environment is that you end up sharing a little bit more. It's just the boundaries are a little bit different. And I think it's partly, often people ask, like, have you ever taken ketamine? And I say yes, like in legal situations, I got it prescribed and then I took it. And this was my experience in IV clinic. And this was my experience getting a lozenge and IM. It's like really helpful for people. And I think there's just like a little bit more like thinking about the container as like being a little bit more known. If something's too blank and you're going into a non-ordinary state, and it can get like really disorienting because it's like you don't know anything about this person. Who is this person? And I said something when we had finished the psychotherapy part after the ketamine. I was like, well, I'll see you next week. I have to go now because I have to pick up my kid. And she was like, oh my God, like I didn't know you had a kid. I've known you for every week for 2 years. And I was like, yeah, it's weird. And I was noticing like, oh, it's true. I have sort of a little bit different rules. And I'm still pretty careful about not going into too many details, but I think it's really helpful for people. And then they kind of know if they have this, like, often moms go into journeys and get like, it can be really disorienting if you have ego dissolution, because then you start, like, one thing that often pops up is, how can I be a mom if I don't have an ego? It's like, as people are landing back into their body, it's like, I have responsibilities. I need to have awareness of who I am and where I am, because I have somebody else that's relying on me, and I think that like the parent thing comes up a lot, and it's helpful for people to know, that you can relate. But yeah, I'm grateful for you even just going through and describing that process, because I think it's really well thought out, and it's really good for people to hear that there's the version of you're a blank slate, and then there's a version that people actually should maybe know more about certain aspects of how you identify to feel safe. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Just one thing I want to add on that, of that, like our identities are in the room anyways. Because our bodies are in the room. So we might as well just name them. and right, like there's a really big difference between making it about you and just sharing, here's who I am and here's who you're talking to. We don't need to go into stories. If people have questions they can ask, and you get to decide how much you want to disclose about that. But kind of the old way of the very like colonial psychotherapy, it's very disembodied, it's very dissociated, it's not acknowledging that practitioners are a human in the room. And even if we are trained to be able to compartmentalize, our stuff is still there. And my perspective with it is actually like not acknowledging the practitioner as a human with a trauma history, with identities, actually increases the risk for ethical violations because you're dissociated from yourself. But if you're actually embodied with all of your identities in the room, there's a higher level of accountability that you're able to hold because you're aware of your own stuff. And our own stuff that is unchecked is usually what leads to ethical transgressions. So I actually think it sets us up to be better practitioners and create safer space for clients.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that even knowing like, yeah, I won't go into a big long story, but I definitely agree. And I think it's important to continue to just like hone in on how we're presenting ourselves. And I think that when you hear presentations like this, you're like, yeah, well, why not say you're polyamorous? That seems normal. Like people say it all the time in bios, but it's, if you become indoctrinated into the medical system and like the psychotherapy system, there's all these ways that people kind of encourage you to take that away. And even for me, putting dyslexia in my bio is like, that was a lot. That was a big deal for me. I was like, am I really doing this? That feels like a huge deal because the system tells you like, don't do that, do the thing. You're professional. You don't have those things. You don't only tell the things that are impressive, and then people can't find you and they don't have the role models, so if someone identifies like that, they don't know who else in the system is safe to talk to about it, or who can, help them with strategies to overcome it, or to like fully embody who they are. So, yeah. So with that, Maya.
Thank you, Emma, for sharing. Beautiful. I always love hearing people's queer psychedelic exploration journeys. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about my kind of journey to understanding my gender identity. I think like from a young age, I was always I had a hard time like really understanding like, okay, I feel different. I feel different than my peers. I feel just kind of like there's something that I need to explore, but I felt like I needed to push away that exploration. And as I like grew and in my circles was starting to hear about psychedelics, I think some of the first words I heard that I associated with psychedelics were like, find yourself. And I was so obsessed with that. I was like, oh my God, like I need to find myself. And ultimately, I think like coming to that realization of like my desire to find myself was rooted in this like realization of like, I knew that I had like an identity thing that I needed to address, but like it felt so lost in the ether, felt so like unattainable. And I wasn't like validating myself enough to be able to do that exploration on my own. So fast forward through many like psychedelic experiences. I'd say like I think it was my first kind of series of experiences with ayahuasca. I remember finally coming to this point of realization of like, oh, I think there's like a part of this that has to do with gender identity. And I remember like in my like pre-experience journal, like writing like 15 things I wanted to work on, like very tiny things, like mystical experiences, ego dissolution, and like in like huge bold letters, like, am I trans? Like big circles. And if that didn't give it away, I don't know what did, but I had just had this like really pressing question, but wasn't allowing myself to accept the reality that I might be trans. So the most beautiful experiences I could ever imagine, my first experiences with ayahuasca, seemed to really just like affirm that identity piece in me, affirming that it's okay for me to open up and it's okay for me to explore what does it mean to be me, and understanding more conceptually of like, how am I showing up in society in a way that feels uncomfortable to me, and almost like psychedelics were a way for me to give myself permission to move forward with transitioning. And that was amazing. I think like I was not ready. Like I'd been talking to many therapists and had been in many psychedelic spaces and was just not ready. That was something I was like pushing away, and I was like, I'm not going to ever open up to anybody, just because it didn't feel safe. And it wasn't until having a really intentional, deep experience with psychedelics that really opened that up for me. So yeah, I think going back to that point earlier about like how even the things that people might not be bringing up in the psychedelic experience or talking about during integration or like pre-session can show up. And that was the case for me. I had the experience, and it still took me a couple months to open up to anybody, of realizing, oh, hey, this is such a reality for me, and I need to now take steps to make this a reality that I can see myself living in. So yeah, I think that's why I hold such a passion for kind of combining the two spaces of like identity exploration and psychedelics, because I think it's so foundational in my experience and many others' experiences of realizing that like there's so much more to ourselves than what we tell ourselves. So yeah.
Thanks, Maya. Can I ask you a couple questions?
Totally.
Are you comfortable sharing like what in the journey? Was it just like it came up, or was it something you saw, or was it something else?
Yeah, so I think for me, the way ayahuasca shows up tends to be like a spirit or a being that I would like communicate with. And this being just kind of like sat in front of me and just like gave me the biggest hug, and just like had so much affirmation and so much love, and was like definitively pouring that out in such a beautiful way that had to do with like embracing my core identity, my core spirit. And it just was such a profound experience that I had like never had that level of affirmation before. So yeah.
Did it feel like it was the spirit hugging Maya the woman, or just Maya
Totally.
yeah.
Really. I remember that actually brought up, it was a very faint experience, or very small blip, but like I had like an experience of being able to like see myself like post transition, or like being able to like see, what does it look like? What do I look like? What does it feel like to be me that isn't the me that is in the room right now, but like the me that feels happy.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And I also think like just our early just wanting to talk about our early conversations before the trans guide that you wrote, or we wrote together, I guess. But just like the kind of goes into a little bit of what Emma was saying about the gender binaries, and I think you had shared to me that it just felt like you wanted to explore. You weren't quite sure how to, and there is something like very binary about how the plant world has developed. So for people that aren't in plant medicine, like ayahuasca, wachuma, they're often assigned genders. So usually ayahuasca is seen as feminine, wachuma, San Pedro cactus is seen as masculine, tobacco is seen as masculine. And so when people then go into the journeys, they often, who knows if no one told you, would you experience ayahuasca as she? I don't know, maybe. But then you come out and people talk about the experiences like she told me. It's a way that it's like, I think it's a really important framework to have. It's like the grandmother, and then it does feel like that experience, but there can be this like extreme binariness of the plant world, and I think that can, if you're transitioning from one to the other, it's like you have to kind of go into the middle, and there's like maybe not that much room for that in those communities. And so I know you said that you had to come back from, you were living and helping work at an ayahuasca community in a country where it's legal, and then came back to go through your transition and kind of explore what that feels like. So just acknowledging that, I think for people that might feel uncomfortable with how binary the psychedelic world language and the understanding is. There's often like the men are on this side, the women are on this side, and it can be weird for people to navigate that. So just naming that and recognizing that if you've been put in that situation, find someone at SoundMind and complain about it. We're here. I also think I've gotten the question before from people that it's like, how when you were, I guess for you, you saw, like, you felt the post-transition you, and so you knew you were going to transition to a woman. But I think sometimes people aren't quite sure. They might be like, I don't feel like that, and I'm not sure if I'm going into non-binary or the other gender. And so do you have any advice for people if they feel like, okay, I'm sure I'm not the thing I'm like presenting to the world right now? And do people, should they explore into non-binariness, and then, or are there other ways that you think that people can know?
Yeah, I think for me, it was really helpful to just open myself up to the idea of exploring something beyond what I was telling myself. And I think, as I saw this kind of like future me, or kind of like was able to like conceptualize that could be a reality for me. Even I think like also what came with that is like the realization of like, whoa, this is a lot. Like I still need to navigate the medical system. I still need to navigate like therapy and getting letters of consent, or letters of referral, and just like all of the things that it takes to come out, and just to like do the things that I felt like I wanted to do. Like with that came so many questions of like, is this real? Like, is this like who I am? Is this like, so I think there were many moments in that where I was like, am I non-binary? Am I like trans femme? Is this just like something wild and something I don't really know what I'm doing? But I think like the best advice is to like, when experiences like that do come up, that kind of show us a part of ourselves that we may be like pushing away, or something we're not sure how to explore, just like keeping ourselves open. I think that's the best way we can show up in life, is recognizing or like challenging our own internal belief systems, and realizing that can like totally change our core identities once we challenge those belief systems. So
yeah, and I also just that identities are constantly fluctuating, that it's not like you have to pick one and then you're stuck there. It's like it can also change. I also think just one thing I wanted to mention about the trans-affirming care guide that we put out with SoundMind is the question of hormones, and whether like there's contraindications with psychedelics and hormones. And so like hormone replacement therapy if someone is trans. And I reach out to the medical community, and it's like, people don't even really know. We don't really know. It's like, are SSRIs really contraindicated with psilocybin? Who knows? Maybe we just have to give a higher dose. So there's a lot that we don't know about medications, but it's especially like, it's especially sort of unknown because there's so few people on hormone replacement therapy right now in the psychedelic field. So I reached out to doctor listservs, and people were like, it doesn't seem like there is. But there can be things that happen in plant medicine retreats that they just tell you to go off all medications. It's like something that don't take anything, and if you're on hormones and then suddenly you're not on them for a week or two, it can be really wacky. And I had a friend that was told to stop her thyroid medications before an ayahuasca journey, which like, then she realized after the journey, she's like, I stopped it and I felt terrible. And then I realized later that like, actually most people are getting those hormones through their thyroid all the time. And so they're not stopping their thyroid, So just if someone is telling you to stop all medications, like just check it, like check with your doctor, check with people that it's really something you have to stop. And if people, sometimes it's more about like the mentality of being pure and like providing a like open vessel and being a clean container. But sometimes going off is not the right thing. But for you, Maya, if you're in a plant medicine community and they say, never go, you're supposed to be off things all the time, then it's like you would never have been able to go on what you needed. So just pushing back against if people are giving you these like sweeping recommendations about things like hormone replacement therapy if you're trans. And it's ongoing, the research, and if there is any contraindications, but it seems like there is not, because people, have those hormones in their system, each gender has it anyways. Anything else about Maya or Emma's presentations that you have questions about from anyone in the chat? And Chris, I don't know if you want to share anything about thoughts, experiences, anything.
Yeah, it's just so much rich discussion. I feel like we could talk for many more hours. Yeah, some things that were coming up, I guess just thinking about my own journey is, I think when I started to acquire the language, which was fairly recently, of, you know, genderqueer, non-binary, I didn't even really hear about pronouns a lot until the last few years. I actually just like went down a journey through my past and just thinking that I had so many instances where, you know, like on the playground in elementary school, before this was really a thing that people paid attention to, I would kind of go and play basketball with the boys and go and play jump rope with the girls. And it was just kind of whatever I felt like doing that day, and nobody cared until we started going through puberty. And then, you know, the roles became more rigid. 3 times during childhood, I dressed for Halloween as like a half man, half woman, you know, like right down the middle.
3 times. It's like every year is your same costume.
Pictures, I was
Your
like,
parents are like, do you want to tell us something? You're like, no. Cool.
I don't know, just having a language has really been helpful. And then Emma, you kind of brought up like this language that goes around a lot in medicine spaces about the divine feminine or the divine masculine. Like I hear that a lot. And even, you know, the traditional male female therapy dyad, people talk about, you know, maternal and paternal transference and how important those things are. And I think that all of those things are important and all of those things are things, but we have so many other archetypes. And so I've really found this sort of trickstery, you know, like forest creature that is kind of the archetype that I really identify with in medicine spaces. And the more I talk about it to people, you know, like in studies and whatnot, like the more people are like, yeah, like that's also something that's important to me, whether they're, you know, straight, cisgender or whatever, like that these other archetypes are things that can be fleshed out. And thinking about the trickster, I'm actually reading a book. Where did it go? I'm reading a book about the archetype of the trickster, and a lot of times it's defined as finding the boundary and either like pushing it a little bit or kind of hopping back and forth between these all sorts of different boundaries. So I just thought that was interesting and has helping me understand myself better. What else? Oh, I love this idea of like finding yourself, because that's just so psychedelic. And I like the Emma that you say psychedelics are queer. And then also, as we design this study, we're thinking of there. I wish I could show you. There's a cartoon that I show of like a forest where all the trees are chopped down, and there's one koala that's like shaking and like holding onto a tree stump. And there are these 2 scientists, and one of them says, this young koala has a mental health disorder. And so I think of that when I'm designing these trials, and just trying to get away from like the tradition of having a DSM diagnosis and pathologizing the individual. And that's why I like the idea of moving more into group therapy and people who have shared lived experiences or shared traumas, that it's less about sort of the pathology of the individual and more about the trauma that's caused by systems. And so thinking, yes, about sort of MDMA assisted group therapy as a space where transgender, gender diverse people can heal together. And maybe that doesn't look like, you know, focus on gender identity issues. Maybe it's just a matter of feeling safe and surrounded by peers enough to go into other trauma issues that don't have anything to do with gender identity. And so a kind of a scientific nerdy thing is we're going to measure the CAPS, which is the standard PTSD, clinician administered PTSD scale that MAPS uses for all of their trials. And we're also going to use this thing called the Gender Minority Stress and Resilience Scale that was developed by, I think, Rayla Testa. It's just a really cool measure of minority stress in gender diverse individuals, and some of the resilience factors that can come. So seeing, you know, kind of how important those two things are in relation to each other during this healing process.
Thank you. Yeah, totally. I love that you're the forest trickster and Emma's the tree. I love it. I think I love what you were saying about the groups being, sharing a trauma, but then looking into whatever trauma they need to look into. And I think that's a big part of the peer support initiative we're doing with veterans. It's like, you have no idea what someone's going to go into, like what their journey will contain. And when we did we filmed a retreat at SoundMind, and some of our participants were BIPOC, and the documentary filmmakers were like, oh, curious to see if there's anything that comes out about that. And the person who, one of the people that was their identity, their whole journey was about how they wanted to like ask their girlfriend to marry them. It had nothing to do with race at all. Or the peer support pair that we have going that we're filming, the Marine that has a lot of Ace, who has a lot of military trauma. It's like he's gone into so many different traumas. So it's like the military trauma has maybe been 2 of his 10 journeys so far. And there's all this other stuff, and I do think that it's kind of arbitrary what, for him, because he has so many traumas, what trauma you're picking to make the group. Is it the BIPOC? Is it the, it's the military trauma? Is it the gun violence trauma? Is it the, sexual trauma in the lineage? There's a lot of things you could put him in a group, but I think just sharing something, I think can be really helpful, because it just does create the safe environment. And I think it's, I'm so excited for when we're all doing trans and queer groups in Oregon soon. Let's see, anything else that y'all want to talk about? Oh, also there's a question.
Yeah, we've got some questions in the thing. Chris, are there any measures in the study that examine the heterogeneity of the trans community, i.e. some have body dysphoria, some do not, etc.?
I think we're open. Right now we have the gender minority stress and resilience scale and the CAPS, but I think other than that, it's like we're looking at attachment, but nothing really specific. So it would be great to talk, because we haven't finalized the set of measures yet. So any input is welcome.
Yeah, it's a good point. That there can be can be different levels of trauma based on like physical versus there's the social traumas, and people experience different levels of each.
I think this kind of goes into the other question that's in here. I think this is from the same person. Curiosity if practitioners have found patterns of trauma in the trans community that may be rooted in the inherent experience of being trans / having body dysphoria, in addition to trauma caused by society and the environment. Speaking from personal experience and thinking of a recent neuroimaging research on trans people. I can say a little bit about that, and then I'm curious for other folks too. Just as a trauma therapist, both as a trauma therapist who works with these populations, and also just in my own experience as a gender fluid person, of that, I think they're connected. Like, I don't think you can really pull them apart and say like, here is just like trauma about being trans or having gender dysphoria and then trauma from society. Like, I think that they intersect with each other. And I know that for me and for a lot of clients I work with, that a big part of the gender identity, just like queer identity development process, and also trauma healing process, is about relationship with self, because we perpetuate homophobia and transphobia onto ourselves, because it's been something that we've internalized. And so that process of healing the inner relationship and the relationship between our parts, I think, is a really important part of the process of being able to embody our authentic selves as that fluidly changes over time, and that our relationship with ourselves has a very strong intersection with our relationship with society, with like communities that we choose, and how we navigate and what our resiliency looks like in the face of all of the microaggressions and violence that queer people experience in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Maya, do you have any thoughts about that too? Oh, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I mean, it's if you're not familiar with it, it's actually a really helpful framework, is Meyer's minority stress model. It started for sexual orientation, like sexual minorities, but then was translated into gender minorities. But there are these different mechanisms that just all of this qualitative research went into these like different categories. And I think it's just helpful to frame in this way, but kind of external mechanisms, so societal stigma, non-affirmation, experiences of discrimination, experiences of rejection, and experiences of victimization can all kind of be this chronic, complex trauma picture from the outside. And then the effects internally, they've categorized into 3 categories. And not that these are like the only things, but I think it's just helpful. Internalized homophobia or internalized transphobia, identity concealment, which is, I think, kind of thematically something you see more with LGBTQIA plus like individuals, participants, compared to like race and racial trauma, where some people don't have the, ability to conceal their identity. But that leads to whole other themes to explore in psychedelic work, is just the topic of identity concealment, and then negative expectations, sort of, expecting new environments to not be safe, or expecting new relationships to not be safe. So just to add that framework.
Thanks. Yeah, and just I wanted to mention this and I forgot, Maya, when you were talking about like the privilege of knowing, to having a bathroom labeled with something that that will be safe, and or just not having to choose. And I think, so I don't know that everyone has ever that people have really thought about what that means, because I think sometimes it's like, well, just pick whichever one you want, but if you're non-binary and there's only male, female, that can be really uncomfortable. But if you're trans and maybe outwardly it's apparent, you don't know if you're safe going into the bathroom that you identify with, because you could have people in there that don't, that aren't welcoming. So, or even someone that sees, you're standing up while you're standing up or something to go to the bathroom. So just the fear around, you don't know who's safe, and that it's not just like about picking one. Maya and I were noticed on the second day of the Horizons conference in Oregon that they put the all gender sign up on the restrooms, and they may have been planning on doing that anyways, but we had been handing out the trans guide, and we were totally taking credit for like, oh my God, somebody read the guide. But I think it's important just to point it out if places don't have or if they don't have an all gender bathroom, then you can suggest it or print out the guide and give it to them, and just to make it comfortable for people, because no one can disagree with this is all gender, it's everyone, no one can fight you on it. So just noting that privilege. Any other thoughts?
I just wanted to have a quick piggyback off of what Emma was saying about like how the trauma, like many different forms of trauma, can be interconnected. And I kind of want to put an image to it because my brain really likes images. I think oftentimes when talking about like trauma process work, we use an analogy of like peeling off the layers of an onion. Like, okay, we have this layer, okay, that's gone. We have this layer, okay, that's gone. But I recently started thinking about it, like almost like an artichoke, how an artichoke has all these many different like interconnected little things that we need to like pull off. And it's not like there's one layer here, but it's all kind of like woven together in this complex pattern. So it's not like we can kind of pinpoint, oh yeah, this trauma is like totally fine now, we're good, but more so this like nuance, like, okay, here are the ways these different traumas are interacting with each other. And yeah, I love putting images into this kind of process work.
Perfect.
That's fun.
I also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Chris, go for it.
Well, I was just gonna say, if it's helpful, I have a video clip that I sometimes play, and the whole podcast, this is like a 3.5 minute clip from a whole podcast episode with Alok, who's a gender activist and author, and they're amazing if you haven't read their stuff. But I've found at the VA, where this is a new concept to a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues, that we can talk and talk and talk and talk, but I've sent this podcast episode to people and they're like, oh, this is really great. Like I feel like I'm finally like in it and ready to learn more. So I can play that at any point before we end if you want.
Yeah, do that.
Let's do it.
Are we
We're
ready?
ready. Yeah, we're
Love
ready.
Alok. Yeah, more Alok is always good.
Yes.
They're the best.
Okay. Let's see. Is that the full screen? Actually, let me make sure that I have the video thing checked. There we go.
And some of us who are oppressed have more capacity to deal with the bullshit than another. Doesn't make us better. It means that for whatever reason we're able. And we need people that are able to do that so that those can learn who otherwise wouldn't. I'm sorry. I'm taking a long time getting out because I'm also getting emotional because I personally, through my life, who champions people, I don't get it all. And I'm feeling bad that I don't get it because you're fucking amazing. And I'm listening to you speak and I'm like, why do I not fight for them? Why do I have such passion for other things? But this one I have a disconnect with. So what do I need to unlearn? How can I help other, and I particularly talk about men, help them unlearn?
Let's get into it. I'm non-binary, which means it's not just that I'm challenging the binary between male, female, man, woman, but between us and them. And in your statement, you said, why don't I help them, as if this struggle is not your struggle too? The reason you don't fight for me is because you're not fighting for yourself fully. And any movement that's trying to emancipate men from the shackles of heteropatriarchy or emancipate women from traditional gender ideology has to have trans and non-binary people at the forefront, because we are actually the most honest. We're tracing the root. Where do these ideas of manhood and womanhood come from? They come from a binary structure. And so that's why people like me, who are visibly gender nonconforming, who are both feminine and masculine and none of the above, we experience the brunt of all of these collective fantasies that were created that are killing other people, that are also killing us. It just looks different. And so one of the things that I try to do in my work is say, don't show up for me because you want to protect me or you want to help me. I don't need your help. I have an unshakable and irrevocable sense of who I am because I am divine. I come from people who were exterminated and targeted by colonists because the gender binary, and we can get into this, was superimposed on Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color by European colonists. And the reason that they targeted us is because they knew our power, right? So the reason that there's so much animus against me is because of my power. I don't need to be legitimized, or I don't have anything to prove. What I want us to rephrase the conversation is, are you ready to heal? And I don't think the majority of people are ready to heal. And that's why they repress us as trans and gender variant people, because they've done this violence to themselves first. They've repressed their own femininity. They've repressed their own gender nonconformity. They've repressed their own ambivalence. They've repressed their own creativity. And so when they see us have the audacity to live a life without compromise, where we say there are no trade-offs, where we say we actually get to carve in the marrow of this earth and create our own goddamn beauty, instead of saying thank you for teaching me another way to live, they try to disappear us because they did that to themselves first. So I guess I would rephrase your question to be, can you help me get free? Not, can you help me help you?
Yep. Thanks for showing that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, it's like the internalized heteropatriarchy, I think, is strong within all of us. So it's a really good thing to think about. Any final thoughts? We have about 10 more minutes. Any final thoughts about what you want people to take away, what you may want people to contemplate who might be wanting to explore, whether it's, you know, gender or sexuality or psychedelics and gender specifically. And
Oh, I'm seeing
yeah,
one.
anything you forgot to say? Yeah.
This last question, just acknowledging sort of yes, there's the trauma and minority stress from external, you know, like societal intolerance and discrimination. And this person is acknowledging also just the innate trauma of having a body that doesn't match your gender identity. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. I think that's what they're talking about.
Totally.
Outside of the context of society. Yeah, good.
Final thoughts? Who wants to go first?
Because I said just from like what Alok just spoke to of that, the work starts inside. And that, you know, if we want to, as practitioners, you know, if you want to be working with the trans, you know, doing what the trans guide says to do, being a trauma attuned, consensual practitioner, being a safe enough person, and that it's not about what you do, it's how you are. It's like your sense of being in the room, and that starts inside your own body. And that if you're not aware of these things, or if you're not trying to get free, like Alok said, then you're not going to be able to hold that space for other people. And one of my teachers frequently reminds me, they say, Emma, you can't take anyone further than you've gone yourself.
Yeah, it's also important to note that that's what we teach everyone with at SoundMind with psychedelics as well, that it's like you have to go into the dark places and really see what's there, so that when someone else goes into the dark places and does, you know, is trying to navigate, you know how that works, how it feels, seeing the shadow sides of yourself, and seeing the expanded, you know, in awe states. It's you to hold the space, you really have to have gone through that. So I definitely think in this context, it's so important to do the work. Yeah. Chris, any final thoughts?
I could say one of my favorite definitions of humility is not knowing what we don't know. And so thinking about cultural humility, you know, even when I'm working with other queer people, like I don't know what their experience of that is. And so sometimes I feel like my job as a psychedelic therapist is just continuing to bring curiosity into the room. And so often I feel like there's a dynamic of them expecting me to be the expert because that's what they've experienced in, you know, the medical system their entire lives. And so just having to continue to kind of reframe gently and guide back to, you know, inner healing intelligence and holding someone through that, but not superimposing my idea of what they need or what they, you know, what the next steps should be. So just bringing that cultural humility, that curiosity into the space every single time.
Thanks, Chris. I also just wanted to do a side answer of how do you approach that in psychedelic therapy. I think I haven't had the experience yet, but we're currently in the SoundMind week 9 of an 8-month program. We're talking about somatics, like whether it's bringing attention to the body or actually touch with the body. And I think how I would approach it is just remaining curious. So if someone goes into psychedelic, like non-ordinary state and is like then feeling into, oh my God, my body isn't the way that I want it to look, or it doesn't feel right, I would just have them keep exploring, where do you feel that? What does it feel like? Being curious, uncovering the layers. So I wouldn't approach it any differently than any sort of somatic and trauma experience. You're remaining open, you're, holding the space for the person to explore what it means, looking at the different sides of it. Maybe someone goes through like, I hate my body, it's disgusting, to like, wow, my body has carried me this long. And what I do love about my body is these parts, maybe I love my feet. So you don't know how someone will explore it, but just remaining curious and leaving that space open for someone to really uncover what's going on. I don't know. Does anyone have any other things they'd add to that?
Would just be really, remind you to be really validating. And even if you don't know what it feels like to have that experience, knowing that you can still sit with people in their experience of pain and trauma and discomfort. You don't have to have walked through the exact same thing yourself to be able to be a support person for somebody. And that, that I think integration with those kind of experiences is really key. Trauma work with psychedelics without really good prep and really good integration, frankly, can be quite dangerous, but also is not as useful. And so making sure to return to that and kind of have a track of what people's relationship with their body is, and inviting in practices and communities that is fostering of what they need during their time of process.
Thank you. Maya, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say just question yourself always, and in a good way. I think it can be so easy to fall into patterns of belief and just accept them as reality and not even realize that that's something we've decided. I think it's a really healthy practice to question, why do I do the things that I do? Why do I say the things that I say? Why am I showing up the way I'm showing up in this moment?
Awesome, thank you. So we are concluding our panel. This will be available for free to all. Please share this if you found it useful with your friends. It will be posted on soundmind.center in the next couple days as a YouTube link, probably. It's also on Facebook now. Yeah, and just super grateful to the three of you and your collective knowledge and experience, and just keeping it real with this topic. So important. And I think it'll become more and more important as more people do psychedelics and they realize this actually isn't some fringe topic. It's it's like very common to start coming up. And so as we sort of open our minds to what the non-ordinary states present to us, the more and more people will want to start wanting to learn about how you look into these topics for yourself, and also help other people just explore and be open and hold space. So Trans Guide is posted, and you can always reach out to us at soundmind.center. If you love the content, you can donate, you don't have to. And yeah, all four of us can be found in the training program at SoundMind as well. And I'm sure we'll do more panels together into the future. So thank you all. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Y'all are amazing.
Bye.
Bye.